My name is Commander Evelyn Carter, and the morning of my wedding began with 5 words that cut deeper than any battlefield wound you're wearing: a uniform, disgraceful. No name, no congratulations, just that. A message from the number I had long ago stopped saving but could never quite forget: my father. The screen dimmed before I could even respond. Not that I would. I had nothing to say to a man who hadn't spoken to me in years except through silence and shadows. And now, on the morning I was supposed to step into a new life, he reached out, not with love, not with pride, but with shame. I stared at the phone for a long moment. Then I set it face down on the dressing table, exhaled, and buttoned the last clasp on my white dress uniform. The fabric was crisp, pressed, impeccable. 4 silver stars on each shoulder, hard-earned, not gifted. Beneath my nameplate lay rows of ribbons, most of them for moments I never speak of. Moments when blood meant more than biology. I adjusted the collar slightly, checked the alignment in the mirror, and stood still. Behind me, the chapel doors remained closed. On the other side were nearly 200 Navy SEALs, men and women I had fought beside, led through sandstorms and firefights, trained and wept for. I hadn't invited them. They had insisted on coming. They'd told my assistant it was non-negotiable, that I would not walk down that aisle alone. And they were right. I wasn't nervous. I'd stood in flooded tunnels with grenades rolling toward my boots. I'd briefed intelligence officers while my body still bore stitches. This was different. This was personal. Because today, I wasn't just showing up as a bride. I was showing up as the soldier I had spent 25 years becoming. And for once, I wasn't going to diminish that for anyone. Not even for the man who raised me to believe a woman's place was somewhere quiet and unseen. I heard the organ start, the doors creaked open, and then it happened. Admiral on deck. The words rang out like a cannon shot across still waters. Every single person in that room rose in perfect unison. Rows of uniformed men and women, from rookies to combat veterans, snapped to attention. Not out of protocol, but out of respect. I stood there stunned, not by the sound, but by the silence that followed. The kind of silence filled with acknowledgement, with truth. My throat tightened, not from nerves, not from sadness, from something deeper, from honor. Because in that instant, surrounded by the very people who had seen me fight, bleed, break, and rise again, they didn't see a woman in a dress. They saw their commander, they saw Evelyn, and they stood. Even now, thinking back, I remember the click of heels, the glint of metals under stained glass, the weight of memory stitched into every seam of my uniform. And I remember what I told myself just before stepping forward. Blood doesn't salute, but honor does. If you've ever had someone try to shame you for becoming exactly who you were meant to be, if you've ever walked into a room not sure who would stand for you, then please leave a like, share this story, and stay with me. Because this is more than a wedding. This is the reckoning of a life built under fire. And I'm just getting started. I was born Evelyn Grace Carter in Fayetteville, North Carolina military town through and through. But my enlistment didn't come with papers. It came with blood. My father, Colonel Richard Carter, lived by 3 words: duty, discipline, obedience. He didn't just wear those values on his sleeve, he carved them into our home, our schedule, our lives. From the outside, our house looked like any other suburban military home flag flying high front lawn trimmed at a perfect 90-degree angle. But inside it ran on precision. Wake up at 600, beds made with hospital corners, shoes lined heel to toe under the bed. Speaking out of turn meant push-ups. Crying meant weakness. Joran said they were reserved for civilians. And I was the exception to his expectations. Not because I was bad, not because I rebelled, but because I was born a girl. To my father, soldiering was not just a profession. It was a legacy, one meant to be passed down to sons, not daughters. So when I showed even a sliver of interest in the military, he shut it down like a drill sergeant shutting down a private's excuse. I remember it clearly. I was 10. He took me to my first Army-Navy game. Most kids would have beamed with excitement, not me. I sat stiff in the bleachers, not allowed to cheer or wear a jersey. At halftime, I pointed toward a group of midshipmen in full uniform and said I want to wear that someday. My dad didn't even glance down. "You'll never wear those colors," he said flatly. "Leave the uniform to men who can carry the weight." He might as well have carved the words into my chest. But I didn't cry. Not then. Not ever in front of him. Instead, I studied him closely. I memorized his every movement. I watched how he polished his boots, how he folded his dress uniform, how he straightened his ribbons like sacred relics. Every Sunday, I'd wake up before him, just to have his shoes lined perfectly by the door. I thought if I did enough, learned enough, became enough, he'd eventually look at me and see a soldier. But admiration in our house was never given, only withheld. My mother, on the other hand, was the softness to his steel. Caroline Carter, an English teacher at the local high school, had a different kind of discipline, one of patience, poetry, and quiet rebellion. She'd leave handwritten quotes from Maya Angelou and Emily Dickinson on my nightstand. She called me Stormchild, wild, fierce, a little too much for the world to hold down. She was the only reason I didn't run the day I turned 18. At dinner, the contrast between them was always clear. My mother would ask about my drawings, my friends, the books I loved. My father would remind me to sit up straight, elbows off the table. Once I brought home a leadership award from a summer program. He didn't even look up from his green beans. "You're not cut out for this," he said, calm as ever. "That's not how we build families." That sentence stuck. Not because it hurt, but because it told me everything about the wall I was up against. Still, I kept going. I didn't know how not to. I kept the spark alive in secret, reading naval history under the covers, memorizing ranks and protocols while my classmates memorized boy band lyrics. When I finally applied to the U.S. Naval Academy, I didn't tell him. I mailed the application from a post office 3 towns over in case someone from base caught wind. I still remember holding the acceptance letter in my trembling hands, running into the living room with a heart full of hope. He stared at the paper for a long, brutal 30 seconds, then walked away. 2 days later, a manila folder appeared on my bed. Inside, brochures for nursing schools, teaching programs, law degrees, not a single anchor. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just resistance. This was rejection. But I wasn't looking for his permission anymore. I was looking for my commission, and I was going to earn it with or without his salute. The first day I walked through the gates of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, I felt like I was walking straight into a storm I'd been training for my entire life. My name had been called, my uniform issued, and yet the voice that should have said, "I'm proud of you," remained silent hundreds of miles away. My father didn't even acknowledge my departure. No farewell, no handshake, not even a note slipped under the door. That morning, Mom cried quietly by the driveway, hands clasped around a thermos of tea she insisted I take. For calm when things get loud, she whispered, her voice shaky. Dad never came out of the house. Plebe summer hit like a wall. They say it's meant to break you down and rebuild you stronger. For me, it was survival. The endless drills, the screaming, the physical beatdowns. But none of it hurt like the absence echoing behind every achievement. When I aced my first tactical test, I reached for the phone, instinctively wanting to call him. Then I remembered I hadn't spoken to him in over 8 months. He'd canceled our Saturday breakfast tradition without a word, skipped my going-away party, and when I mailed a letter after my first 60 days at the academy, it came back unopened. He wasn't mad. He had made a decision. I was no longer on the family map. But my mother. She never let go. Every Sunday, like clockwork, a care package arrived. Herbal teas, protein bars, sometimes a page from a poetry book she'd annotated in the margins. One week, she sent me a note that simply read, "You weren't born to bend. You were born to steer." That became my silent mantra. I rose through Annapolis like a ghost on fire. I wasn't the loudest, but I was the most focused. I volunteered for the toughest shifts, the messiest tasks. I earned respect not with words, but with actions. I carried more than my rucksack. I carried silence. And in a way, that weight built my backbone. But the real test came in my second year. During a field exercise simulation, I was assigned squad leader. Our objective was to infiltrate and recover an intel cache in a wooded environment. All strategy, no shortcuts. My squad was stacked with guys from military families, some third-generation Navy. One of them, Mitchell, laughed when I started the briefing. "Let me guess," he said. "You're gonna read us poetry while we flank the enemy." The others chuckled. I said nothing. I handed them each a route map with custom escape vectors I'd pre-written, then led the mission like clockwork. We finished the simulation 23 minutes ahead of schedule. 0 mistakes. 0 noise. When the commander debriefed us, he looked at Mitchell and said, "You'd do well to listen to her next time." She just outmaneuvered every other unit by a mile. Mitchell never laughed again. I wanted to tell my father about it. I wanted to say, "See, I didn't just belong, I led." But I didn't. I simply wrote another letter, short, straightforward, just one sentence. "We were top of class this week. I led the squad. I never received a response." That was when I stopped writing. Instead, I built myself one quiet victory at a time. At graduation, I stood at attention in full dress, whites, a gold bar freshly pinned to my collar. My mother was there, tears spilling behind dark sunglasses. My father wasn't. Someone asked if he was deployed. I said no. He just doesn't believe in where I'm going. But I did. I believed in the road ahead because I had already survived the war behind me. And if you've ever had to walk a path your own family told you not to take, if you've ever stood alone at your own moment of triumph, then you understand what it means to salute not the approval you never got, but the courage it took to keep going anyway. My first assignment after graduating from Annapolis was at the U.S. Naval Base in Okinawa. It wasn't glamorous. Logistics, paperwork, personnel rotations, none of it made headlines. But to me, it was the proving ground I didn't know I needed. Every form I processed, every sleeping quarter I restructured, every clunky operation I streamlined, it was all part of earning the respect I wasn't given at home. Most of the men I served with were twice my age, built like tanks, and seasoned by more deployments than birthdays remembered. They didn't say it out loud, but I heard it in their eyes. "She's just here to check a box." That perception followed me everywhere like a shadow I hadn't earned but was expected to outrun. So I didn't speak up much. Instead, I paid attention. I worked harder than anyone in the room. While they chased promotions, I chased excellence. When the lights in the operations building dimmed at 2200, I was still at my desk triple-checking logistics chains and practicing contingency plans. I wasn't interested in becoming the loudest voice. I wanted to be the most trusted one. Then came 2007. I was a lieutenant commander by then, posted temporarily on a classified support mission near the Horn of Africa. Our recon team, a unit of 6, was ambushed during what should have been a routine transport resupply. 2 were hit. 1 was trapped behind a rusted shipping container, pinned down by gunfire, and fast bleeding from a leg wound that looked beyond salvageable. Protocol dictated that I remain back. I wasn't boots on ground essential for this phase. But protocol didn't know what it felt like to hear a soldier scream for help while waiting for medevac that might come too late. So I broke protocol. I crossed 40 yards under open fire. No cover, just adrenaline and calculation. I dragged that man, Petty Officer Luis Ramirez, behind the closest structure, ripped my belt into a makeshift tourniquet, and shoved my entire weight onto his femoral artery to slow the bleeding. My other hand stayed pressed to the comms, demanding coordinates for immediate airlift. Shrapnel tore into my side. I didn't stop. By the time the helicopter landed, my white undershirt had turned crimson. But Ramirez was breathing. That was enough. They called me Iceback after that. Said I bled ice, not blood. Said I moved like a machine under fire. But the truth is, I wasn't proud of the nickname. I was proud of one thing: Luis survived. Months later, I got a Christmas card from him. It read, "Still walking. Avery says hi. His daughter, named after me." That moment, that changed something. Suddenly, the command noticed. I was no longer just a paper pusher or a checkbox. I was the officer who ran into bullets and brought her team back whole. But while the brass handed out cautious praise, my own pain sat silently in my body. 2 surgeries, 4 months of rehab, learning to walk again without limping. I endured it mostly alone because in those days, strength wasn't what you showed, it was what you hid. Even when I returned, some still treated it like luck. Like I had been lucky, not capable. But I knew better, and Luis knew. He once wrote me, "You didn't just save my life. You saved my daughter from losing her father." I kept that card in my locker folded behind my ID. Because medals don't always reflect what matters. But memories do. If you've ever done something no one believed you could. If you've ever been the only person in the room who didn't give up, then you understand respect doesn't come from ceremony. It comes from action. And that day, under a rain of bullets, I didn't earn a title. I earned their trust. And that to me meant everything. By the time I returned stateside in 2009, the whispers had changed. No longer just the girl officer, I'd become the one who pulled Ramirez out. My name floated through corridors, across operations briefings, up through command offices. Not loudly, but persistently. The kind of quiet recognition that can't be bought or forced. The kind that starts with a single decision under fire. I was reassigned to Coronado, California, home of the Navy SEAL training grounds. My new orders oversee logistics and support for Bud-S candidates, the most grueling physical and psychological test the Navy offers. I knew the politics would be ugly. Change always is. And I wasn't just walking into a man's world, I was walking into a tradition. From day one, I noticed the patterns. Good candidates washed out for the wrong reasons. Recruits who showed mental strength and leadership under pressure were dropped for failing arbitrary legacy metrics. Others, sons of generals, protégés of admirals, passed with glowing scores they barely earned. It wasn't sabotage, it was inertia. The system was broken, and no one wanted to say it out loud. So I did. Not in a speech, not in a press release. I rewrote the training module manuals in silence. Every policy change, every adjustment to how we evaluated mental resilience, every safety checkpoint added to prevent injury, I logged it, submitted it, and pushed it through channels without asking permission. I knew they wouldn't listen if I told them it was about fairness. But they'd listen to numbers. Within 12 months, dropout rates dropped by 12%. Major injuries were cut nearly in half. And more importantly, the caliber of leadership coming through the ranks stronger, sharper, sharpened by something deeper than just grit purpose. I never got a commendation for it, but I didn't want one. What I got instead were the small things. A recruit who stopped me outside the mess hall to say thank you, ma'am. You changed the way they saw me. A fellow officer who pulled me aside and whispered, "We needed this." But none of us had the spine, and slowly the walls started to bend. Even the old brass men who once raised an eyebrow every time I entered a room began to greet me with sincerity. "Good morning, ma'am, not performative, real." But still no word from my father. I sent him an update once after one of the revised programs got picked up fleet-wide. Attached was a report showing success rates, retention boosts morale gains. I ended the message with "I'm applying the values you taught me, just differently." No response. I found out later from one of his old West Point friends that he'd read the report 3 times, then tore it in half. That hurt more than the silence. Because silence can be ignorance. But tearing something in half, that's rejection. Still, I kept going. Because I knew what mattered more than recognition was change. Not just for me. For the sailors I trained. For the lives I protected from a system that too often said, suffer to prove yourself instead of grow to become stronger. And maybe deep down I still hoped he'd see it. That one day he'd look past the uniform and see the human it carried. But even if he never did, I had made peace with it. Because respect, real respect, doesn't come from lineage. It comes from impact. And I'd learned that if you want to reshape a tradition, you don't have to break it apart. You just have to build it better. If you've ever had to change a system from the inside out, if you've ever stayed up night after night doing the right thing with no applause, no spotlight, just your own sense of duty, then maybe you know what it feels like to stand tall in a quiet storm. And if you do, then stay with me. Because this isn't just my story. It might be yours too. And if that resonates even a little, take a second to share your own story in the comments. Leave a like. Let someone else know they're not alone in rebuilding what others took for granted. Promotions came steadily after Coronado. Commander, then captain. Every step forward came with weight, responsibility, and silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around milestones like a fog. Because while the Navy recognized me, pinned new bars to my collar, hosted ceremonies, and posed for photos, one person never stood in the back of the room. Never sent a card. Never picked up the phone. My father. By the time I made Rear Admiral, I had stopped expecting anything. I'd already thrown away too many hopes. But a part of me, some stubborn thread of the daughter I once was, still tried. I sent him one final letter handwritten like he always preferred when I was little. No demands, no anger, just the truth. I know you don't agree with my path, but I took your lessons, all of them, and I've led men and women with the values you taught me. I've done it in uniform, and I've done it well. There was no reply, just more silence. Until 3 weeks later when a letter arrived. Heavy envelope, no return address, inside 5 words. They're just making you a symbol. No context, no warmth, no closure. I stared at the handwriting for a long time. The same sharp angles I had once copied to forge his signature on field trip permission slips. The same ink that used to sign my report cards clipped to the refrigerator with military magnets. But now those lines felt colder than any battlefield. They're just making you a symbol. As if everything I'd done, the nights in triage units, the bodies I pulled from wreckage, the trainees I saved from career-ending injuries, the sailors I mentored through PTSD meant nothing. Just politics, just tokenism. He reduced my entire life to a PR campaign. And that was when I knew with final clarity. He didn't see me. Not as a soldier, not as a leader, not even as a daughter, only as a defector. I burned the letter in the sink, not in rage, but in finality. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my dress whites, pressed every seam, polished every brass button until it gleamed, folded my ribbons with the kind of reverence my father once reserved for his own. Not for a ceremony, not for an inspection, but because I'd be wearing it for my wedding. See, I had met someone. James was nothing like my father. No medals, no barked orders. He didn't carry scars the way my teammates did, but he understood structure, understood commitment. More than that, he understood me. We met during a Department of Defense working group. He was a civilian intelligence analyst, sharp-eyed, thoughtful. Our first conversation was a debate about formatting protocols. He said mine was inefficient. I told him clarity beats speed every time. The next morning, he'd rewritten his entire presentation using my structure and left a note on my desk. You were right. That was the beginning. He never asked why I disappeared at 2 a.m., never pried when I came home silent and stone-eyed, never flinched when he saw the fatigue in my shoulders or the calluses on my hands. Instead, he asked things like, how did it feel the first time someone called you Admiral, or what keeps you calm under chaos? He didn't want the part of me that smiled for the cameras. He wanted the part that stayed awake rewriting policy manuals at 3 a.m., the part that remembered every name on every casualty list. When he proposed, it wasn't dramatic, just a quiet pier boots dangling over the edge salt in the air. He opened a small worn box and said, let me serve beside you, wherever that means. I didn't cry. I just said yes. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt what no rank had ever given me. Home. But I knew the wedding wouldn't be simple. Nothing about my life ever was. And this time I wasn't just walking into a ceremony. I was walking into the collision between who I'd become and the man who still refused to see it. And I would do it wearing white, just not the kind he ever imagined. Planning the wedding felt like walking a tightrope between tradition and truth. James wanted something simple, honest, no spectacle, no pretense. And I agreed. No bridesmaids, no glittering ballroom. Just us, a Navy chaplain we trusted, and a space that felt sacred. We chose the Naval Chapel in Norfolk. Clean lines, arched wood history echoing in its quiet corners. A place where vows would feel more like promises between equals, not recitations for show. I told James I'd be wearing my dress whites. He smiled without hesitation and said, good. That's how I met you. That's how I want to marry you. There was never a moment of doubt in him. Not when I was called away mid-dinner to handle a base emergency. Not when I canceled vacations for sudden deployments. Not even when I'd come home carrying the weight of what I couldn't speak about. James didn't ask me to shrink to fit into the space of a wife. He expanded the space to hold all of me. His calm was unshakable. His loyalty was quiet and steady. When I asked him once how he felt marrying someone whose life was built around war zones and operations, no one could mention, he simply said, you've already fought enough battles. Let me stand guard while you rest. We agreed on the date early spring. Norfolk would be blooming. The sky would be that bright navy blue that always reminded me of mornings on deployment, crisp, expectant. I sent out minimal invitations. My unit, a few close colleagues, and a handful of people who had seen the journey from its darkest corridors. And then, against my better judgment, I sent one more envelope to my father. No preamble, no plea. Just a white card with black ink. I'm getting married this Saturday. 1,300 hours, Naval Chapel, Norfolk. I'll be in uniform. You're welcome to attend. That was it. No RSVP ever came. The night before the wedding, James and I kept tradition. Separate rooms. He stayed with his best friend from college. I stayed on base in the guest quarters alone. That solitude wasn't loneliness, it was preparation. I reviewed the ceremony, quietly ran through protocol one last time, then laid out my uniform like ritual. I pressed the sleeves myself, adjusted every fold, polished the silver belt buckle until it reflected back, not just my face, but every scar, every choice, every fight I'd ever taken on and won. It was the same uniform I'd worn while standing over fallen comrades during deployments in the Middle East, while briefing the Pentagon on operations they didn't want to admit had happened. But tomorrow I would wear it for love. And I needed to do it right. At midnight, I stood in front of the mirror, 4 stars resting on my shoulders, white gloves folded beside me, and whispered the words my mother once said as I left for Annapolis. You weren't born to be silent. You were born to stand. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, hands in my lap, and waited for sleep. Morning came faster than expected. A bright, sharp, early spring sun cut through the base like a knife. The chapel glowed in its path. When I arrived, I didn't expect a crowd, but parked outside were familiar faces, men I hadn't seen in years, retired SEALs, former intel officers, engineers, commanders, all in full dress standing in quiet formation. No one told them to come. They just did. I asked one of them, Petty Officer Hill, why they were there. He grinned and said, "You walked us through hell. Let us walk you to something better." They weren't invited guests. They were my chosen family. And that meant more than any seating chart or flower arrangement ever could. And in that moment, before the chapel doors opened, before the music began and the world paused, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not nervousness. Belonging? If you've ever built your own family from the people who stood by you when blood didn't. If you've ever been held not by tradition but by loyalty, then you understand what it means to walk into the next chapter with eyes wide open. And if that resonates, share this story. Leave a comment. Let others know the ones who stand for you don't always come from your past. Sometimes they show up when you need them most. The air inside the chapel was cool, steady, like the calm before a mission. I stood just beyond the heavy wooden doors, flanked by 2 men who had seen more of my life than my own father ever did. On my left was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hill, the same man who once pulled me out of a helicopter crash in Kandahar, arm bleeding, refusing to leave me behind. On my right, Senior Chief Javier Torres, who had lost a leg to an IED in Syria and still beat every 20-something in morning PT drills. They had been through the worst with me, and now they were here for my best. "You sure you don't want to walk down alone?" Hill asked, his voice low, almost reverent. I shook my head. "No, you walked beside me through fire. Walk beside me through this." He nodded. No salute, just understanding. 15 minutes remained. I adjusted the cuffs on my gloves, ran my hand across the stars on my shoulders, let my eyes drift across the stained glass, catching pieces of light that bounced like memories off the floor. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I shouldn't have checked it, but I did. The screen lit up with a message from a number I never saved but always recognized. "You're wearing a uniform to your wedding. Disgraceful." No greeting, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of the 2 decades of silence, the thousands of miles walked, the wars fought, the lives led. Just the same verdict he'd passed on me since the day I chose a path he refused to understand. I stared at the message. My heart didn't race. It slowed. And in that quiet pause, I realized something. Shame only works if you agree with it. And I didn't anymore. I slid the phone into my pocket without replying, smoothed the front of my jacket, straightened my spine because that was the only kind of response he'd ever taught me, and ironically, the one I now used to defy him. The organ music began. Hill and Torres stepped forward with me, boots thudding in rhythm on the polished wood. And as the chapel doors opened, something extraordinary happened. 200 men and women, officers, sailors, SEALs, commanders, technicians, every rank, every race, every history stood in complete silence. Not because protocol required it, but because respect did. And then one clear voice rang out, "Admiral on deck." The words echoed off every beam and every wall like a wave of truth that could no longer be denied. They stood not for the uniform, not for the stars on my shoulder, not even for the title. They stood because they had seen me at my most exhausted, my most commanding, my most human. They stood because I had led them not with volume, but with presence. Not with force, but with clarity. Not by demanding respect, but by earning it. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I looked ahead toward James at the altar. He wasn't crying either, but his eyes shimmered. He stood at ease, hands folded behind his back, the way he knew I preferred. Behind him stood our chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Rhodes, who had once led midnight services for our unit in Afghanistan. He wore his own medals on his chest. We all did. No masks, no pretenses. Just truth worn proudly and silently. I reached the altar. Hill and Torres stepped back with a dignity no words could match. And James took my gloved hands in his and whispered, "You don't need vows to know how I feel. I've been married to your courage from the start. I closed my eyes, let the room fade, and in that moment I understood something no letter from my father could ever erase. This wasn't about tradition. This was about transformation. I wasn't walking into someone else's version of marriage. I was walking into a life I had forged from fire. If you've ever walked forward carrying the weight of someone else's silence, if you've ever been saluted not for a title, but for the life you've built, then you know the power of walking your truth in front of the world. And if that speaks to you, stay, watch, comment. Let someone else know they're not alone. We all deserve someone who stands when we enter the room because they know what it took to walk in. The aisle felt longer than I expected. Not because I was nervous, not in the way most brides might be, but because every step felt like crossing a bridge I had spent my whole life building. With each boot hitting the polished floor, I wasn't just walking toward James. I was walking through every version of myself I had survived to become. I could feel them, the echoes of past battles stitched into every seam of my dress whites. The silence I had endured, the commands I had given, the bodies I had lifted, the words I had never received. They all moved with me not as burdens, but as threads in the uniform I wore. As I advanced, I passed rows of men and women I had once led through fire, some in full uniform, some with service ribbons worn proudly, some with eyes rimmed red from battles too personal to name. They rose to their feet, not with theatrical flair, but in a wave of stillness so profound it felt like time itself stood in formation. And then, in perfect sync, their voices rang out again, "Admiral on deck." This time it wasn't shouted. It was breathed, whispered like reverence, as if the very air around them demanded it, and the sound settled not in my ears, but in my chest. It was the most sacred silence I had ever walked through. Not a ceremony, a salute. I approached James slowly. He was standing tall, shoulders back, steady gaze. His lips curled slightly as I reached him, his hands folded behind his back like a soldier on guard, but I knew he wasn't guarding himself. He was honoring the space around me. I turned slightly and looked across the chapel. It was full. Every seat. People I'd bled beside, people I'd buried friends with, people I'd promoted, disciplined, consoled, rescued. People who never once questioned my place at the helm. They didn't just attend, they stood, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. That realization hit me harder than any medal I'd ever received, because in that moment I understood the truth I'd spent decades chasing. I wasn't being seen through the lens of what I'd had to prove. I was being seen without question, without caveat, fully. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing in the exact center of my own belonging. The chaplain stepped forward and opened his binder, but paused, sensing the weight in the air. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the children in the room were quiet, like they understood something deeper was happening. Then James stepped toward me and took my gloved hands in his own. He leaned in and whispered, "You don't need to say anything for me to know. I already married your strength a long time ago." I smiled, small grounded. And when we turned to face the chaplain together, there was no need for elaborate vows. No promises layered with poetry. We kept it simple. We vowed to serve each other, to protect not just each other's bodies, but each other's peace, to honor not just joy, but sacrifice, to lead together and, when necessary, to follow one another into the unknown. When I said when the orders come, we follow together, when they don't, we build our own mission. James nodded, not because it was a vow, but because it was already true. The chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, and the chapel didn't erupt. It stood still. Reverent. Then came the applause, not for spectacle, but for truth. Earned, deep. The kind of clapping that starts in the chest before it reaches the hands. We stepped out from the altar under an arch of sabers' blades gleaming in the spring light. Traditionally, that arch is held by officers. But today, it was the enlisted men who lifted their swords for me. That gesture meant everything, because it told the full story without needing a single word. If you've ever had to earn your seat at the table 10 times over, if you've ever built a legacy from silence, doubt, or rejection, then you know the most powerful salute isn't one you're given. It's the one you've lived your whole life becoming worthy of. And when it finally arrives, it changes everything. The reception was small, just like we wanted. A simple gathering on base, no chandeliers or tiered cakes, just folding tables, catered barbecue, and a playlist that mixed country ballads with Fleetwood Mac. But the simplicity didn't mean the night lacked weight. In fact, it was the opposite. The quiet moments carried more meaning than speeches ever could. I spent most of the night drifting from conversation to conversation, an arm squeezed here, a quiet thank you whispered there. Men I had deployed with, women I had mentored. One by one, they stepped forward, not as guests, but as chapters of a life I'd fought to write on my own terms. One of my former SEALs, Corporal Danvers, built like a bear, covered in tattoos, the kind of guy who never spoke, unless it was life or death, walked up to me near the punch table. He looked down at my boots, nodded once, and said, "We never stood for you because of your rank, ma'am. We stood because you never made us feel small." Then he hugged me, not like a subordinate, not like a peer, like a brother. One who understood the kind of war you fight silently every day against judgment, expectation, and being dismissed before you even open your mouth. I wasn't used to being held like that, but I let myself be held not because I needed comfort, but because I had earned it. Around midnight, after the music faded and the toasts had ended, I stepped outside. The spring air had cooled. The moon hung low over the Atlantic like a coin tossed into the sky by someone who didn't believe in luck but was hoping for it anyway. I stood at the edge of the pier, hands in my pockets, breathing slowly, and then James joined me. No words at first, just his presence, his steady rhythm. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Did you hear from him?" I nodded once. He waited, then I said it. He called it disgraceful. James didn't flinch. He just turned his head slightly, looking at me, then back toward the water. "Do you believe that?" he asked. I looked down at my uniform, creased with care, decorated with the stories I never told, stitched with discipline and grief and triumph. I thought about the SEALs standing in formation, about the words "Admiral on deck," about the way my team had flanked me not out of obligation but reverence. "No," I said softly, "I don't. Because here's the truth. I had spent years chasing a man's approval, thinking that if I just climbed high enough, bled hard enough, led well enough, he might finally look at me and see something he respected. But the farther I rose, the smaller his voice became. And tonight, standing under the stars with my husband beside me, I finally realized it wasn't me he doubted, it was himself. Some people can't understand strength unless it looks like them. Some people mistake authority for volume. And some, like my father, wrap their pride in silence so tight they forget how to hand it to the person who's earned it. But others? They show up, they stand, they salute, even when they don't have to. If you've ever had to unlearn what someone told you you couldn't be, if you've ever been called a disappointment while wearing the truth of your success on your chest, then you know the most powerful thing you can do is walk tall anyway. And if you're reading this right now and you've been there, leave a comment. Share your story. Because someone else needs to know respect doesn't come from the people who fail to see you. It comes from those who choose to stand when you walk into the room. It happened 3 days into our honeymoon. James had found a quiet coastal inn in Maine. No cell service, no schedule, no interruptions. Just the two of us, creaky wooden floors, the smell of sea salt and blueberry pancakes, served by a retired Marine named Roy who called everyone kid. I hadn't touched my phone since the wedding. Not out of defiance, out of peace. For the first time in years, I had nothing to oversee, no drills to review, no crises demanding my voice. I slept in. I laughed out loud. I forgot just briefly what it felt like to hold the weight of an entire unit's expectations on my back. But on that third morning, James gently handed me my phone. His expression was soft, careful. "You should see this," he said. I unlocked the screen. A single message from my cousin Claire, no caption, just 2 photos. The first was taken from across the street through the tinted windows of a parked car. It showed the chapel parking lot on our wedding day. At the far edge of the frame, unmistakable in his rigid posture, stood my father. Full dress uniform, arms crossed, cap low over his eyes. Watching, not entering. I stared at the photo for a long time, not sure what I was searching for. Regret, softness, even just presence. Then I swiped to the second image. It caught him mid-turn, walking away, back still straight, shoulders squared, a soldier even in retreat. I didn't cry, not right away. But a hollow opened up in my chest that I hadn't felt since my mother's funeral. That same emptiness where I wished words could be, where I hoped for an arm on my shoulder or a voice saying, "You did well, kid." James stood behind me, his hand resting gently on my back. He came, he said, but he still couldn't stand. And he was right. When the world rose to salute me, my father turned his back. He came close enough to witness the life I had built, the love I had earned, the soldiers who stood for me, the silence I had broken. But he couldn't bring himself to cross the threshold. Couldn't let go of whatever script he had written about who his daughter should have been. That night, I went out to the water alone. The moon reflected on the dark waves like metals pinned to an invisible ocean. I thought about all the things I had done for him, letters sent, photos, mailed achievements, wrapped in the hope of recognition. I realized none of it had ever been enough to shift whatever armor he wore around his expectations. But maybe it wasn't my job to shift him. Maybe it was my job to stop needing him to move. Because his silence no longer defined me. His absence no longer cracked me. I was already whole. Still something lingered. Not pain, not anger, just that small question. Was it too late? Was redemption still possible? The answer didn't come quickly, but it did come. A few days later, back home, an envelope arrived. Cream-colored, heavy cardstock. No return address, but I knew the handwriting the second I saw it. I didn't open it right away. I made tea. I sat down. I let the stillness settle before I slid a knife along the seal. Inside was a single page. I didn't enter the chapel because I didn't know how to sit among people who saw in you what I refused to. I didn't salute, not because you didn't earn it, but because I no longer knew how to honor what I didn't understand. I was wrong. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk. No uniform, no protocol, just a father trying to understand a daughter he never took the time to know. Frank. I read it 3 times, then folded it slowly and placed it beside the old Christmas card from Ramirez's daughter Avery. Not everything can be fixed, but some things can begin. And if you've ever waited years for someone to see who you truly are, if you've ever had to stop chasing their approval just to reclaim your own peace, then you understand the power of even a single sentence, "I was wrong." If that sentence ever found its way into your life, or if you're still waiting for it, leave your story below. Because someone out there needs to hear they're not alone in that silence. And sometimes a whisper of truth can be louder than a lifetime of denial. 1 week later, I met him at Arlington. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long silver lines across the grass. The cemetery was quiet, reverent, each headstone a silent witness to sacrifice to stories buried deeper than the soil. I arrived early, in uniform. Not to make a point, but because it was who I was. Not because I wanted him to feel small, but because I refused to shrink. My father was already there, standing by my mother's headstone. No uniform, no rank, just a charcoal blazer, slacks, and a jacket that hung a little looser than I remembered. He looked older, smaller, not weak, just worn. He turned when he heard my footsteps, but didn't smile, didn't salute. He said quietly, "You look like your mother when you stand like that." I didn't respond at first. Not because I was holding back, but because I wasn't sure how to begin a conversation 25 years in the making. We stood in silence for a while. The wind rustled through the trees like an old war hymn. Finally I spoke. She would have loved to see that day. He nodded, still facing the stone. "She always believed you were meant to fly. I thought you'd burn out. She knew you'd rise." I looked down at her grave. Caroline May Carter, beloved wife, devoted mother, keeper of storms. The epitaph was her own words. She had scribbled them into a note I found after she passed. "Some girls are rain, some are thunder, and some, my love, are storms meant to fly." He cleared his throat. "I should have told you she was sick sooner. I should have done a lot of things." I swallowed the lump building in my chest. "You kept her from me." He winced. "I thought if I told you, you'd come home, leave all that behind. I couldn't watch you bury her in uniform." "And she died without knowing I'd made it?" I said. "No," he replied softly. "She knew. She always knew." The words hung in the air like smoke, neither settling nor fading. We talked about her mostly, about books she loved, the garden she never got to finish, how she used to leave folded poems on the dash of his car. We didn't talk about the years of silence, the letters I wrote that went unanswered, the photos that were never acknowledged. Not yet. Eventually, he turned to me, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know how to be proud of you. I only knew how to be hard." That's what the Corps taught me. Win, advance, keep your head down, never show weakness. I thought letting go of control meant letting go of love. I took a deep breath, and I thought if I became perfect, you'd finally see me. He looked up, eyes wet. "I see you now." And then slowly, stiffly, he stepped back, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand. Not a crisp military salute, not textbook posture, but deliberate, earnest. It landed harder than any medal I'd ever received. I returned it not because I owed him forgiveness, but because I was ready to release the weight. Not because everything was healed, but because some salutes aren't about hierarchy. They're about humanity. We stood there, hand to brow, father and daughter, not as soldier and defector, not as adversaries, but as two flawed people finally meeting in the middle of the storm. When we lowered our arms, neither of us spoke. He stepped forward, placed one hand gently on my shoulder, then turned to leave. No long goodbye, no dramatic ending, just a beginning. That night, lying beside James, I whispered, he saluted. James didn't ask what it meant. He just reached for my hand and held it. Rain tapped against the windows in soft, steady rhythm. Some people think reconciliation comes in grand gestures. But sometimes it's this, a single step forward, a broken man trying, a daughter letting herself be seen. And if you've ever stood in a graveyard waiting for someone to finally say, I see you, it's not about making the past disappear. It's about no longer letting it define your worth. 3 months after Arlington, I got the letter that changed everything. It came in a simple white envelope with a Department of Defense stamp, nothing flashy, just official. I assumed it was another inquiry, a routine request, maybe a speaking engagement or a policy roundtable. I'd been getting more of those since the ceremony. More invitations, more doors opening. People suddenly saw me as a symbol. But when I opened the letter, I froze. It wasn't a request. It was a notice. A transfer. The Pentagon wanted me to return this time not for combat strategy, not for training missions, but for something far more delicate and frankly far more dangerous, a leadership position on a newly formed ethics advisory board, focused on bridging the generational gap in military command. In short, I would be sitting across from men who once dismissed me, this time with a vote, a voice, and authority. I didn't know how to feel. Proud, nervous, vindicated. All of the above. But also hesitant. Because power, when you've spent your whole life proving yourself to people who refuse to see you, can be a strange thing. You question whether you're finally being recognized or simply being used as a symbol to patch up a broken image. I sat with James that night on our porch, watching the wind bend the trees. I told him about the transfer. He listened without interrupting. Then he leaned forward and said something that pierced straight through me. They didn't hand you that seat, Claire. You built it. Every mission, every bruise, every night you cried alone, wondering if it was worth it. This isn't decoration, it's repayment. I stared at him. What if I fail? He smiled. You've already succeeded by showing up in rooms they tried to lock you out of. All you have to do now is speak. I accepted the transfer. The first meeting was exactly what I feared: stiff collars, tight smiles, a table filled with men who carried medals like shields and memories like war wounds. Some remembered me from earlier missions. Some remembered rumors. A few glanced at my insignia with raised eyebrows. But I didn't shrink. Not anymore. I laid my notes on the polished oak table, looked every single one of them in the eye, and began. Gentlemen, we've all worn the uniform. But not all of us have carried the same battles. And for the first time, no one interrupted me. No eye rolls, no dismissive clearing of throats. Just silence, attention. I spoke of Ramirez, of Morgan, of my own journey. I shared how leadership isn't just about tactics, it's about who we trust to lead when the terrain gets personal. I didn't cry, I didn't grandstand, I just told the truth. And when I finished, the youngest colonel in the room, barely 40, leaned forward and said, "We should have had you here 10 years ago." Another said, "We still have a lot of learning to do." It wasn't applause. It wasn't instant change, but it was acknowledgement. That night I walked out of the building alone, briefcase in hand. The cold DC air hit like ice water, but I felt warm, whole. I didn't need validation anymore. I had my voice, and I had learned how to use it. If you've ever found yourself in a room full of people who once doubted you and you stood anyway, tell your story. Because your voice could be the one that makes another woman believe she belongs there too. And if you're still waiting for your seat at the table, don't stop. The table may be theirs today, but the floor under it, that was always yours. A year passed. Promotions came, panels, conferences, interviews. But what stayed with me wasn't the podiums, it was the letters. Hundreds of them. From women in uniform, mothers of cadets, even young girls in ROTC programs. They wrote to say thank you, to share their own battles, their bruises, their silence. One girl from Texas wrote, "When I saw you in that ceremony, I realized I didn't have to apologize for dreaming too big." Another stationed in Okinawa said, "They used to laugh when I said I wanted to lead. Now they ask for my opinion." And then came the letter that cracked me open. It was from Ramirez's sister, handwritten. She said she had followed my career quietly, too heartbroken at first to speak. But after the ceremony, she wanted me to know that her brother had always believed I'd make it. That he used to say Claire doesn't walk into rooms. She owns them, just waits until the world catches up. She ended the letter with a sentence I will never forget. You didn't just carry his memory, you fulfilled it. I cried for an hour after reading that, not out of grief but gratitude. Because for so long I had thought of my path as solitary a storm I had to weather alone. But now I saw it was never just mine. Every step I took had become a bridge, every scar a map. And now others were following it. One day I was invited to give the commencement speech at the Naval Academy. The first female graduate to ever do so. I wore my dress blues, hair pinned tight. But when I walked onto that stage and looked out at the sea of young cadets, my voice trembled for the first time in years. Not out of fear, out of reverence. I told them the truth. That leadership is lonely. That success doesn't erase pain, it just makes you strong enough to carry it. That courage isn't always loud. It's often the whisper that says, go again. And then I said this. Don't wait for applause. Don't wait for someone to tell you that you're enough. If you're in the room, it's because you earned it. And if someone tries to silence you, use your silence like thunder. Let it shake the walls until they listen. When I stepped down from the podium, the standing ovation wasn't just for me. It was for every woman who'd ever been told she was too much. Too loud, too soft, too ambitious, too emotional, too strong, too anything, and still showed up, still led, still stayed, still flew. If you've ever been told you don't belong, remember they only say that to people powerful enough to change the space they enter. Tell us your story, because someone is waiting to see themselves in your courage, and if no one else says it, I see you. You belong. Don't ever dim your light to make someone else feel comfortable in the dark. 2 years after the Arlington ceremony, I returned this time with James and our daughter Sophie. She was 12 then, all lanky limbs and questions that never stopped. We had told her stories, of course, about my time in service, the medals in the case, the people whose names were etched into my bones. But this was different. This was sacred ground. As we walked through the gates, she held my hand tighter. Is this where Grandpa said goodbye to Grandma? I nodded heart tight, yes baby, right here. We stopped at my mother's headstone first. Sophie bent down, tracing the carved letters with her fingers. She was quiet for a long time, then whispered, She sounds brave. She was, I said, kneeling beside her. Not in the way soldiers are, but in the way mothers are, in the way women are when they choose love over silence. Then we walked to the memorial wall, nearby the one that bore the names of the lost, the fallen, the unforgotten. Ramirez was there. Sophie asked, Did he really save you? I smiled. He saved more than me. He saved the part of me that wanted to give up. That thought I wasn't enough. And then as we turned to leave, something unexpected happened. My father arrived. Unannounced, uninvited. Wearing the same old blazer, his hair whiter now, gait slower. He nodded at James, who returned it respectfully. Then his eyes fell on Sophie. She looks like your mother, he said softly. Sophie blinked, unsure. Hi. He crouched slowly, carefully, looked her in the eye. Your mom, he said, voice gravel thick, is the bravest person I've ever known. You should be proud of her. Not just because she wore the stars, but because she earned them the hard way. Sophie looked at me. I gave her a little nod. I already am, she said. And in that moment, under that gray sky between those rows of silence, I felt it. The war was over. Not the ones fought in foreign soil, but the one inside me. The one between the daughter who needed approval and the woman who no longer did. I had spent years fighting ghosts of expectations, of silence, of conditional love. But standing there, hand in hand with my daughter, beside a father trying in his own broken way to be better, I understood something profound. Legacy isn't just what we leave behind. It's what we refuse to pass on. I would not pass on silence, or shame, or the belief that love must be earned. Sophie would grow up knowing that strength isn't about rank or ribbons. It's about standing tall when the world tries to make you small. About telling your truth even when your voice shakes. And as we walked back to the car, Sophie slipped her hand into mine again. You think I could ever be a general, she asked. I stopped crouched beside her, eyes level. Baby, I said you were born to lead storms. We drove home in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace, of healing, of stories finally told. And that night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she said, When I grow up, I want to be like you. I smiled. No, when you grow up, be like you. Because that's the real victory. Not becoming who they told you to be, but becoming someone they never saw coming and doing it with grace, with fire, with love. And if you've made it this far, if you've walked with me through every twist, every scar, every salute, I hope you take this with you. Your story matters, your pain has power, and your voice can rewrite history. There's something sacred about telling your story, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. I didn't share mine to be admired. I shared it because for too long, too many of us have stayed silent in rooms that demanded our silence. I lived through dismissal, betrayal, and the quiet kind of loneliness that settles when you realize even your family doesn't see you. But I also lived through healing, through reclaiming, through choosing not to be who they expected, but becoming who I was meant to be. This wasn't just a revenge story, it was a rebirth. And if you've ever felt too small in your own home, if you've ever been told to quiet your ambition, your pain, your truth, let this be your reminder you're not alone. You're not too much. You're not wrong for wanting more, and you don't owe anyone your silence. The scars they gave you, they're not shameful. They're proof that you survived. So stand, speak, lead. Whether you're in uniform or not, your voice is a weapon they never expected, and a light someone else is waiting to follow. If this story touched, you don't let it end here. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your story deserves to be heard. Hit that subscribe button not just for me, but for every voice that's been told to sit down. Let's build a space where storms are seen, not silenced. And together, let's fly.